Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. It is my great honor to speak a little bit today, a part of this lecture, and as a part of the Gender Lab, or Gen Lab, Gender Research Laboratory that is a new initiative at the Institute. So before my colleague introduces the lecture, I'll speak a little bit about the laboratory. Like I mentioned, it's a new initiative at the Institute whose main goal is to research and gather knowledge and disseminate knowledge on the issues of gender as a concept, but also the ways in which it relates to socioeconomic, political, philosophical, and aesthetic issues. That said, it is also a laboratory that seeks to collaborate with other institutes and universities in this region. So as a newly formed and a young laboratory, we're looking forward to hosting this lecture as being our first within the initiative. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. It was my great pleasure to welcome today Emma Brown Dewhurts. I have to say, her paper is on Maximus, but not on Opusculum. And because we already had a very successful conference on Opuscula, but we also wanted to continue with Maximus, but also to bring people who are interested in gender studies. And this two combines in Emma's work. Emma Brown Dewhurts is a very dear friend of mine who is working on St. Maximus for the last 10 years, I would say. Emma finished her degree in theology at the University of Edinburgh, and she did her master in Edinburgh working on Maximus. After that, she continued her studies, working towards PhD at the University of Durham, where she obtained her PhD degree again on Maximus and ethics. After that, she was teaching for several years at the University of Edinburgh, and now she's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Munich. Emma combines studies of St. Maximus and Church Fathers of Greek East with some modern issues, ethical issues. She's also a Christian anarchist, contributing to the studies of Christian anarchism, and she's actually, with a lot of us Maximian scholars are not doing, applying Maximian studies to modern environmental, political, ideological, whatsoever problems. Now she will present us I would say that's a very important topic today in Maximian studies, the topic of gender and sex. And her topic is the absence of sex and gender in the thought of Maximus the Confessor, a 7th century challenge to gender norms. Please. Do you want to stay there?
We must remote.
Welcome. Can you all hear me? This is okay? Okay, so some of us have been listening about Maximus for the last 2 days, and some people maybe have just joined us. So at the risk of possibly boring some people, I will give you a very brief introduction. Who is this bloke Maximus, and why do we care about him? So Maximus is living 580 to 662 AD. There's some debate over his early life, because we have two competing lives of Maximus, but he probably lived in Constantinople, and at some point gave up that life to go and become a monk. As far as we know, he was never a priest, he was never an abbot, he was just a monk. and yet people have written to him from all over the empire. He gets letters from courtiers in Byzantium, from rich ladies, from monks, from bishops and archbishops, all asking him for his advice. So even in his day, despite being a monk, he's recognized as a very eminent theologian. Today he's most well known for his theology of the two wills. This was a big theological dispute of his day, but there are plenty of other aspects of his thought that are very important. And the reason why I want to talk about him today is because he's still of central importance, especially in Orthodox theology, and he's becoming more used now in ethics. So the problem that I'm going to frame today is talking about some contemporary Orthodox theology that started to use the thought of St. Maximus to understand ethics and to talk especially today about sex and gender. So the reason I'm talking about Maximus on this topic is because he's actually already being used in this way in contemporary ethics. So this is my purpose today, not to say that one ought to use Maximus as your go-to, but rather to say that he already is being used in this fashion, and that I currently think that he's being misrepresented in the way in which he's being used today. So my intention is to outline what I think is a more accurate representation of his theology on sexual distinction, and propose that this leads us to contemporary conclusions that challenge rather than support a socially conservative status quo. So this will become clearer what I'm getting at here, but this is my rough purpose today. So this is the kind of 3 points that I will talk about. I'm firstly going to look at what does Maximus say that's particularly unusual about sex and gender. Secondly, look at the other contemporary understandings of Maximus, so go through why they think this is important for today, what this says, and I'm going to kind of scrutinize some of those arguments. So I'll have to introduce a slightly more complex theology, but hopefully those of you who aren't Maximians will also follow this. And then finally is the bit for everybody, is what conclusions can we draw with this new interpretation of what's going on in Maximus for contemporary ethics? Why is this important? So I wanted to very briefly say what I'm going to be saying Maximus says. So I will go into a bit of detail about how I get to these points. One note is to say, in my title I talk about sex and gender. These are very contemporary distinctions that obviously didn't exist in Maximus's time. This isn't a huge problem for us because sexual difference, as we translate Maximus's term, both includes our contemporary understanding of sex and gender. So we can use this somewhat interchangeably, at least for our purposes today. So these are the 4 points that, am I standing in front of you? I can't read it. These are the 4 points that I want to end up saying Maximus says. So this is very roughly the important stuff to take away, is that first of all, he thinks that humans were originally intended to have no sexual differences. And second of all, that he thinks that this will again be the case in the afterlife. Third of all, this relates to how he thinks that reproduction was originally meant to happen, because he does think there was intended to be a human reproduction, but he says somehow this was intended to happen without any sexual organs, without any sexual distinctions. And lastly, this is a point that also is only relevant because of the opposition to what Maximus is saying. Humans have always had physical bodies, but our physical bodies used to be more ruled by our souls. So you can see there's some very contentious views here, even for Maximus's day. There aren't many people who are saying this stuff. Someone like Gregory of Nyssa is saying similar things, but not everybody is saying stuff that's this revolutionary in terms of what he thinks the human used to look like. So I later on will come on to say how can this very different theology start to challenge and some of the ways in which we think about the role of sex and gender today in society. But first of all then, so where does Maximus get this from? How can he end up saying that sex and gender don't matter? And my main source here is Ambiguum 41. And this is perhaps very familiar to some Maximus scholars. To those who are not familiar with it, it will look very strange. In this ambiguum, we have several divisions which are outlined, and each level we see here. So this is Maximus's kind of rough picture of what the cosmos looks like. There are ways in which so the created is split into intelligible and sensible. The sensible is split into heaven and earth. Earth is split into paradise and the inhabited world. And the human is split into male and female. So this bottom one is especially important for us today. So these divisions of nature, as Maximus calls them, are the way that creation has been ruptured by sin. And these are divisions that will be overcome and brought back into unity in Christ. And the overcoming of divisions in nature is a key theme throughout Ambiguum 41, and it rehearses the way that humans bring together the cosmos by going through these 5 key divisions. And this is a mediating ability that is restored to humans in Christ. So this is what humans are intended to do, is to, things have been split apart, but the human was intended to mediate all these divisions and will bring them back through Christ. But in almost all these divisions, and this is the Greek term we're using here, diaresis, there's a difference that's maintained. So this is the English terminology doesn't work so well. There's a difference between division and difference, and it's not that the uncreated and created will ever be a total unity in the sense that one will be obliterated. So even though there will be a union, there will remain a distinction, and this is important all the way through in all of these divisions of creation. Somehow, heaven and earth will be united, but there will still be a distinction that we can talk about between heaven and earth. Somehow paradise and the inhabited world will be brought into unity, but we can still see a distinction. And this is the same language that Maximus uses from Chalcedon in talking about the natures of Christ. So they're unified, but they're distinct. Now it's important to remember that this is not the case for this last division. And there's a lot of work that's been done recently by Soterius Mitraillexis especially, and by some others on this that we'll come on to. But in male and female, both the division and the difference, Maximus says, will be removed. So this is the only instance where he especially goes into detail to say, this is a division but was never intended to be there, and it won't be there again. Sorry?
Please speak a little bit.
So a recent paper by Soterius clarifies Maximus on this point. Not only is sexual difference removed in the eschaton, in the afterlife, and by this we mean both sexual division and reproduction, but the difference between male and female is not even a part of humanity's logos. And so for those who don't know logos here, it's not really a word we can define very, very quickly, but this is something like the intended divine blueprint for humanity. So it's not even there in what we were meant to be. And this has a very big impact on how we think of what a human being is. So Maximus is saying that whatever it means to be a human, originally, it wasn't meant to have anything to do with gender. There were meant to be no distinctions like this. And the importance of saying that it was never intended that humanity would have these sexual distinctions means that we're no longer just talking about how creation will be transfigured in the afterlife, we're also discussing the originally intended nature of humanity. So Maximus proposed that God perhaps originally intended for humans to reproduce in some other way. And he says that sexual difference is an alteration that's introduced effectively as a result of sin. So hence why it is that this is something that must be healed in Christ. And he says humans were condemned to reproduction through seeds like grass and like the other animals. So why does Maximus claim this when we've got passages like Genesis saying humans created male and female, Doesn't this seem, why is he getting concerned about what's going on here? Why is this something that he's thought up? That humans weren't ever intended to have sex or gender. And I think one of the reasons we've got this big kind of idea coming from Maximus comes from the conflict between Genesis passages like he created the male and female, and between the New Testament, where we've got passages where we're told that in Christ there will be no male and female, and additional passages about resurrected bodies being like the angels, and about humans will no longer be given to one another in marriage. So we have all these instances of, in some way in the eschaton, human bodies will look different. Human bodies don't seem to, whatever male and female was, it somehow doesn't matter. So I think Maximus is here trying to square, how can this not matter, and yet also we've got this stuff coming from Genesis, where it does seem to matter in some way. And it seems then that, if this is the hope for life to come, that the human body will change and will have no sexual organs, why would God have created us with differences that are ultimately meant to be eradicated? And the answer really seems to be that these must be differences that are only needed on Earth, or only introduced to life on Earth, so in a post-lapsarian sense, so after the fall. So sexual difference in some way for Maximus seems to be tied to fallenness and seems to be tied to sin. So what does he say about this? He says that there's a balance between the body and the soul that during the fall has somehow been usurped, somehow been turned on its head. So previously the soul was the head of the body, and we're now tied to the sufferings of the flesh. So it's not that we ever anticipate leaving the body behind, since we've already always been a body and a soul simultaneously. It's that prior to the fall, the soul had pride of place, and now we've developed a propensity towards the passions, and passions here is in the ascetic Greek use, so things which divert our attention away from God, distractions that are to do with worldly things rather than where our thoughts should be. So we've become orientated towards bodily things rather than looking towards the spiritual. And one such change for Maximus seems to be reproduction. We now reproduce in a more bodily and less spiritual way, he says. So I now want to look at some opposition to Maximus here, and the opposition is actually to my reading. It's an opposition to a literal reading of Maximus here. And as some might imagine, what he's saying is quite controversial, and lots of modern theologians who value Maximus have wanted to kind of say, is this really what he's saying here? Is there perhaps a more metaphorical understanding of what's going on? So I'm going to look at four main arguments that are used to say Maximus meant this is metaphorical, and I kind of take apart each argument and say, no, he didn't. So the first argument, and I paraphrase here to kind of reconstruct what these theologians are saying. The first three arguments I look at are from Costache's Living Above Gender. And effectively, his argument is that Maximus says that marriage is good, therefore humanity in its male and female iterations is good, and an abolition of sexual difference must be metaphorical. That's a kind of rough gist of his argument. So he characterizes, Costache characterizes the discussion of genderless humans as existing within a debate concerning whether humans should be celibate ascetics or choose a life of marriage. So a genderless character of humanity is interpreted as part of this larger paradigm that rejects bodily passions and a desire for sex and pleasure. So this is the first way he's framing his argument. So it takes a bit of reconstruction to get why he thinks this is important. So by arguing that Maximus defends marriage, Costache argues that the strength of a position stating that humanity was intended to be without gender is diminished. So he claims that this positive assessment of our gendered nature, i.e. in heterosexual marriage, demonstrates that gendered experience is holy and therefore implies that any genderless expression of humanity must be purely metaphorical. So that's the line that he's going with first here. And I perhaps unsurprisingly think that it's too big of a leap to say that to discuss marriage here is relevant, basically. So the leap from saying genderless human beings to negative use of marriage seems to be too great a one to be a useful means of rejecting our literal reading. And it would rely on the following three premises to be true. And I'll explain why I think none of these premises are true. He first of all tells us that effectively genderless humanity as a concept only exists as an ascetic rejection of the holiness of sexual desire in marriage. And maybe it's better to go through one by one here. Yeah, so this is the top one here. And yet, Maximus never equivocates choosing ascetic celibacy with the absence of sexual difference. Whilst it's clear that Maximus believes that the absence of sexual difference was originally more tied up with a kind of more spiritual birth, it's not clear why this should map onto a debate about celibacy versus marriage. So this is my first problem with this argument is, why is saying marriage is good going to be relevant to defending a metaphorical reading of this here? And the second thing he ends up kind of implying in his argument is, if there is any evidence at all, or something that has to be true in order for his argument to stand, if there is any evidence at all that Maximus believes sexual desire and marriage are good, and holy, then a literal genderless humanity cannot have been what he intended to articulate. So it's not clear to me why an affirmation of marriage as holy would have any bearing on whether Maximus believes there could originally have been a humanity devoid of sexual difference, since it's not unusual to affirm that things that were meant to be different in original creation and will be different in the eschaton, and also to affirm that there can be a holy way of living with these changes. As an example here, so St. Maximus thinks that the passions and human attachment to earthly things is clearly something sinful. It's something that happens after the fall, and yet there can be a way of life that transforms these and gives them a kind of holy attention. So even though you have something sinful, it can be redirected in such a fashion that there is a holy aspect to it. So it's not clear that this argument works on those lines. And then finally, the other premise that must hold true is that if Maximus affirms that marriage is good, he must be affirming that the gendered existence of male and female are good and holy, and the only valid way in which humans have gendered expression. And my problems with this are that affirming that marriage is good doesn't mean that this institution was the way things were intended to be in original creation, or will be in the eschaton, and that passage that we had about humans will no longer give one another in marriage is relevant here. Secondly, that the affirmation that marriage is good doesn't tell us that this is how humans should be living. It's a way of living that can be positive, as is ascetic celibacy. Thirdly, that affirming there can be good ways to live as male and female doesn't grant this gendered existence a holy role that necessarily extends beyond fallen human existence. And finally, affirming that marriage between male and female is good does nothing to rule out the possibility that other expressions of gender or living without this gendered expression within our life on Earth are problematic or invalid. Neither does it indicate that genderlessness ought to be relegated to being metaphorical. So these are the reasons why I think effectively saying marriage is good has nothing to do with whether or not Maximus should be taken literally here and metaphorically when he's talking about a genderless humanity. This is my longest argument, they're not all this long. But so the second argument that Costache makes is effectively that Maximus never believed that humanity was bodiless or asexual, therefore the abolition of sexual difference is metaphorical. Now for people who don't do early patristics, this will be a very, very strange argument. And for people who do lots of patristics, this is a very familiar looking picture, because this is really about origin. This is a concern that Costache has about origin. And the concern with humans being bodiless stems from Origen's understanding of the creation narrative, where he thought that souls pre-existed bodies, and hence human beings were bodiless and sexless prior to joining their physical bodies. So automatically, when you talk about a sexless humanity within the context of the early church, lots of people are thinking that you're talking about, oh, you mean when humanity had no body. But nowhere in Maximus do we see him saying that a discussion of genderlessness is ever a discussion of something without a body. For him, this is a very embodied approach. And yet, kind of throughout this article by Costache, this is a conflation that we see. This is something I will come on to. But he seeks to argue that by saying that Maximus is clearly anti-Origenist, by saying that Maximus believes in embodied humanity always, he doesn't believe in the pre-existence of the soul, therefore we can't talk about a literal reading of genderlessness in Maximus. And as I was just intimating here, our first problem is that the absence of a body and the absence of sexual difference can't be equated to each other. Defending Maximus from this bodily account of human creation doesn't equate an elimination of a genderless, sexless account of humanity. And we've got evidence of this conflation throughout this article, and also I'm picking on Costache here only because he did this groundbreaking article that lots of other people have built on. So lots of other people are using this argument as well. And serious consideration of an embodied, genderless human is not given any weight in this paper or in other papers either. And it's dismissed as a mythologizing eccentricity. So thirdly, the only other mention that Costache makes of the idea of a bodily, genderless humanity is to clarify that the state above gender should never be confused with a tertium genus of either androgyny or eunuchism. And I'll briefly say, so here's the third argument he's making. Maximus never believed in androgynous humans because natures don't change, therefore we've always been male and female, and the abolition of gender must be metaphorical. So the state above gender here is Costache's chosen term for his metaphorical reading, where gender becomes irrelevant, but it's still present. And the basis for this argument against androgyny is that he says there will never be ontological obliteration of differences in the process of spiritual transformation, not even eschatologically. Now, I have two main problems with this argument. First of all, if Maximus isn't convinced that sexual difference was ever really intended, then perhaps this is not an obliteration but a restoration. And then secondly, what does he mean by there will never be ontological obliteration? We've got plenty of instances of the ways in which human nature has changed as a result of the fall and will be healed again. I mean, if human nature hasn't changed in some way, then why does it need healing? Why does Christ need to take it on? Why does it need to be restored? So I think both of these points, I think, don't stand. And finally, this argument comes from Adam Cooper. This is another perhaps slightly strange argument that needs a little bit of reconstructing to do it justice. Cooper argues that removing sexual distinction is metaphorical because it refers to the overlooking of gendered particulars in favour of seeing genderless whole human nature. So what he means by this is it's effectively so inconceivable to think of a particular human as not having gender that any time Maximus is talking about genderlessness, he actually must be referring to the whole of human nature in general. He must be referring to the universal of humanity, which is the only time you could ever express the absence of gender within human beings. So he says human nature is composite of male and female genders and sexes, and it's this whole human nature that's being referred to here as sexless and genderless. And then he goes on to say, not only is the love of human nature as a whole, this genderless, sexless, universal, desirable, but much more important should be the love of particulars, which will always be gendered, sexed, specific instances of human nature. So you can see he's kind of constructed an understanding of what Maximus must be talking about here, which I will go on to say, I don't think this is a correct way of presenting Maximus's thought. So Cooper then goes on to say that Maximus seems to be implying we should focus on loving all human nature in general, which means seeing beyond the differences within humanity, which include male and female. And then Cooper takes apart this position to say, considering such problems as where this leaves love and its particularity, and whether it's right to overlook the particular and bodily accidents in favour of thinking of humanity as a whole universal. So he kind of sets up this argument and then takes it apart to say, actually, we should always be loving, male and female instances of humanity as well. So we've got, these are my main problems with this, and this is my last kind of overview of contemporary difficulties that are trying to justify this metaphorical reading of Maximus. So Cooper contextualizes Maximus in larger works, but in this instance, these works are not pertinent to the point at hand. The overcoming of strife and division between humans, which is the topic of the Centuries on Love, which is one of the places he draws from, is not the same as the way that it's dealt with in Ambiguum 41. And at no point in Ambiguum 41 are we led to believe that a genderless, sexless humanity that Maximus talks of is some kind of generic human nature. At no point does Maximus tell us to only love human nature in general and to forget the particular. This is just not present. So Maximus is talking about the irrelevance of sexual differences, and if one assumes that this must be dismissing particularized existence, then all this really does is betray that you as a contemporary theologian have a commitment to attaching personhood to sexual distinction. And this is something that I don't think is present in Maximus, and I don't think is present in Gregory, whom he draws on either. Okay, so this is in a nutshell, why I think this position must be wrong. And then to be charitable to this view, I think even if you agreed with them, even if you agreed that that Maximus is being metaphorical, that gender is never completely removed, gender and sex are never completely removed, even if you thought that it simply becomes irrelevant and we kind of learn to love a more general humanity beyond seeing people as particular sexes, that still can have like big ethical consequences. That still can have a lot of like ethical relevance, because you're effectively saying, like, whether you are male or female doesn't matter in the way that I love you as a human being. And this is a big ethical statement that can still be very transformative. And yet, in both of these two theologians we've just looked at, this proposition is ignored. So even if you are charitable and accept this interpretation, this is still something that's absent. I don't know if we have time to... so this is a very brief overview of instances where there's a kind of a resistance to actually even considering the ethical implications of the view that these theologians have just suggested. So we first of all have Costache claiming that when he's discussing virtues, he really means this in an existential way and not in an ethical way. But if you study the virtues in Maximus, you're studying how should we be good human beings? How do we reach towards theosis? How do we reach towards God? What does it mean to live a good life? And these are ethical topics. There is not a way that you can separate out talking about the virtues in Maximus from any of the rest of his theology. And personally, I think you are almost always doing ethics when you do some part of Maximus. So there's an inevitable ethical discussion that ends up happening here. And Costache wants to say, genderless holiness is a kind of personal ascetic state of mind. It doesn't really have any social implications. And even when he says the narrow divisive character of the gender feature is overcome, so that any person appears simply as a human being, he immediately then clarifies that these transfigured relationships, beyond violence, addictions, and selfish urges, are not to be understood as any obliteration of our gendered particularities. And this to me is a conclusion that just isn't supported by his own argument. This to me seems to be a conclusion that is more concerned with not changing the status quo in the current way in which gender roles play a part in our society, and doesn't seem to come out of the theology that he's using, because we have plenty of instances, even within a metaphorical understanding of Maximus here, that will start to transfigure the way that actually gender roles should be thought of in light of this theology. So I don't have too much time to talk about this here, but in the larger paper I spent more time here. Because I instead want to move on to the final area of this talk, and to talk about why this is relevant for ethics. Why is it relevant? Why is Maximus's belief that humans originally had no sexual distinction a relevant topic for ethics? And if we still have sexual organs now, why is it relevant what may have been once or what might become again in the eschaton? And what I want to say is it's relevant because it means that the theology of Maximus the Confessor, in this theology, holiness has nothing to do with sexual organs. And consequently, expectations and social conventions surrounding gender have nothing to do with what it means to live a holy life. So being a good person has nothing to do with conforming to gender roles. And these are the sorts of conclusions that we can start to draw out of this. If it doesn't matter whether you're male and female, then how can it matter that you live in a particularly female way or live in a particularly male way? So morally speaking, this doesn't seem to be something that we can say. So here are 3 ways in which this theological position can start to impact our contemporary ethics. And the first is the abolition of gender discrimination. So we've got no moral grounds for discrimination based on sex and gender here. Regardless of current distinctions in humans, there's no sexual difference that exists today that is of theological importance in the eschaton. So to live out an ethics that's informed by what is to come, we ought to consider that what it means to be holy isn't bordered or boundaried by any distinction made of the sexes. So that's the first way in which it challenges things, is there are never any grounds for discrimination on this basis, theologically. And the second point is the abolition of social gender norms. If there are no male and female in the eschaton, then we should rethink all gendered roles and associated baggage that we attach to sex and gender in society. So lots of current distinctions that we think of as belonging to gender more rightly belong to capitalism or consumerism. So the marketization of gender distinction has helped to construct so much paraphernalia surrounding gender that many people kind of consider this to be gender itself. So we ought to reconsider the way that our societies have structured gender to capitalize on and monetize personal identity. So social norms surrounding gender have been used to restrict and confine the presentation of people, limit the sort of work that people ought to be doing. All of this no longer has any theological justification if we believe in the abolition of sexual difference in Maximus. If you base your ethics on what he seems to be saying, you can start to see lots of these ideas as actually being consistent. So it's not what Maximus says, but if you kind of take the conclusions of his thought, this is the kind of thing that will that we have to see as naturally arising from this thought. So this means promoting ideas that are familiar to those, to some of us, where women ought to be encouraged to take up work in more male-dominated workplaces, maybe in engineering and hard sciences, whilst men would be encouraged to take up on more caring professions. So this is a kind of more noticeable application, but it also raises questions like, what does it mean to be male and female, and why should sexual distinctions dictate what we wear, who raises children, who we love. So I think this also gives us good ground to start reconsidering issues of homosexuality. We've got good grounds for supporting romantic love between people of the same sex and gender. If we're called to love people as humans and not as separate iterations of binary gender, then the romantic love between those of the same sex perhaps ought to be understood as the same as heterosexual love. So this is all, it starts to come out of, if lots of the value and importance of sex and gender is constructed purely by us and doesn't have any theological grounds, then in what ways can we start deconstructing the walls that we've built that don't seem to have theological importance? And my final point then is about the abolition of gender conformity. So a challenge to the concepts of male and female in and of themselves. So whilst many people feel comfortable living with the social paraphernalia surrounding gender, there are also many who do not. And in some instances, this manifests as rejecting the norms of expected gender, or the norms expected of a gender. And in others, it manifests more strongly as a rejection of how your own body appears. So dysphoria are experienced as alienation from one's body and as a rejection of both the physical and social apparatus surrounding the gender one's been assigned at birth. This is a tacit place of understanding within Maximus's thought. There's a comforting reminder that it's all right not to feel at ease with the sex of one's body. These are differences in human bodies that we can live without, and one day will live without, Maximus thinks. So this gives us a way into talking about gender dysphoria that can focus on easing the distress of those experiencing it, rather than trying to fit such discomforts into a binary that's not present either scientifically or theologically. And today, one of the most marginalized groups in society is those who are transgender, those who don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And one of the radical things about this 7th century theology is that there are the theological grounds for understanding and empathizing with those who experience this dysphoria. So Maximus points out that the Bible is actually very inconsistent on sex and gender, and that for him we can ultimately anticipate these confusions being removed in Christ. So finally, this is my points for today, is that we first of all have to consider Maximus to be committed to the theological view that prelapsarian, so before the fall, and eschatological, so in the afterlife, humanity will be both bodily and genderless. I've shown that the metaphorical reading of Maximus on this topic seems to be insufficient. We don't have enough evidence to say that this is really what Maximus intended to say. I've said that we can't divorce this topic from ethics because it reflects on what qualities are of importance when seeking to fulfill human logos, to become like Christ. And whilst no defence has been given for why one ought to believe in Maximus's view, for those who find value in the rest of Maximus's corpus, his views on what humanity was meant to be like can't be ignored. So for those of us who want to do Maximus in the rest of our lives in our theology, this is something that we have to deal with, something that we have to find a place with. It's not a mythologizing eccentricity. So we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss this position just because it's initially something that sounds very strange, that doesn't quite fit in with our expectations. Since just because this position doesn't presently conform to a 21st century status quo does not mean it's not speaking to others who have a great need of its wisdom and comfort. Thank you very much.